Hello, everybody. This is Glenn Loury. You are listening to and or watching The Glenn Show. I am Emeritus Professor of Economics at Brown University and Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution. And I'm talking today with Jason Riley, who writes at the editorial page at the New York Times. Oh my God. At the Wall Street Journal. Oh my God. See, I'm used to introducing McWhorter. He writes at the Wall Street Journal and he writes books, and he is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Welcome, Jason.
Thanks for having me, Glenn.
Man, I'm delighted to have you. We are looking forward, you and I, to a conference at Stanford's Hoover Institution in October, celebrating the life and work of Thomas Sowell. We were just talking about that. You're going to be participating in that. You are a biographer of Sowell.
Yes.
Maverick is what you call this wonderful book that you've written, and I wanted to talk to you about that. I am tasked as a distinguished visiting fellow at Stanford with helping to organize this conference, and will be playing a role in editing a volume that will come out of it with Stephen Davis, who's economist and director of research at Stanford's Hoover Institution. But anyway, we're talking Tom Sowell.
Yeah.
So I had a couple of themes that I wanted to explore. One is the distinctive contributions that he's made and the impact that he's had in public and in more scholarly circles around questions of political theory and economics. But the other was, if you're willing to talk a little bit about the interplay between his identity as an African American and as an economist and social critic on public affairs. So that's kind of how I was thinking about this.
Sure. Well, first, I'm thrilled that the Hoover Institution is doing this. He's been based out there since 1980, and I learned that they were planning something a few months ago. And my first concern was, Tom is in his mid-90s. You shouldn't be planning things several months out for people in their mid-90s. It should be this coming weekend. We're planning to honor Thomas Sowell. Can you make it?
But, is he in good health?
I believe he is. It's been a few months since I've interacted with him. I saw him, I believe, earlier this year. I was out there for something. And we got together for lunch. And of course, he slowed down. Let's see, he was born in 1930, so he turned 95 this year. So he has slowed down. But we went out. We had lunch at a restaurant. He was very lucid. I enjoyed it.
Wow.
So, and I think since then we've exchanged a few emails. So yeah, he's fine. But as you may know from knowing him over the years, he is not someone who is really into this sort of thing where you're honoring him for something. He is more than willing to pass on these sorts of things, or send someone to accept an award for him. He's not really into the self-aggrandizement aspects of being a public intellectual and icon that he's become. So I'm really, really thrilled that Hoover is doing this and that he agreed to participate in the program. So that is great. And secondly, I'm glad that you invited me on to talk about, as you said, his economic contributions, his contributions to political philosophy, social theory, because that is the work, Glenn, he is most proud of in his career. As we know, he's most famous, he's most well known for his writings on race and ethnicity and those types of things. But he's said, I didn't do that out of sort of a intellectual pursuit. That was not my goal when I got into decide to become an academic. That is not something I decided to focus on. He almost reluctantly did it. He says in his memoir, I did it out of a sense of duty because there were things I thought needed to be said, and there were too few people who were willing to say them, or at least say them out loud. But that is not where he's sort of spent his energies intellectually. His energies intellectually have been on economic history, history of ideas, political philosophy, social theory. That's, I believe, what he hopes his legacy will be. And so I'm really thrilled to focus on that aspect of his scholarship because that's what he wants us to be focused on, frankly.
Yeah. Well, I have been reviewing his works as I prepare for the conference, rereading, reading, and rereading. The big books like Knowledge and Decisions, uh, uh, A Conflict of Visions, uh, Ethnic America, Race and Culture, Migration and Culture. And I see what you mean. I mean, I see, first of all, a guy that's he's a theorist, even though he's not a formalist. You know what I mean? I mean, he's a conceptualizer. He's um, got a broad philosophical framework that he's bringing to bear. Um, but how would you characterize the distinctive features of his political philosophy? Uh, what do you think the big ideas are?
Well, I think that if you want to get inside of his head to sort of understand where he's coming from on any issue he's writing about, racial or non racial, the books you named are the books to go to. Knowledge and Decisions, Conflict of Visions. Um, he considers them his most accomplished works. And not only does he consider them his most accomplished works, so do his fellow intellectuals in those fields, his peers, people who follow the history of ideas, the history of economic thought. They consider those books to be his most enduring contributions going forward. And so, if you want to understand where Tom is coming from on ethnicity, on race, on migrations, on the history of intellectuals, and so forth. Those are the books where he sort of lays out the template that he's working from to engage all of these other topics that he's writing about. So, so he gets his PhD in the history of ideas, the history of economic thought from the University of Chicago in 1968. Um, he's studying under Milton Friedman and George Stigler. They were both thesis advisors for his dissertation at the University of Chicago. People like to consider him an acolyte of Friedman primarily, but the reality is that he went to Chicago to study under Stigler, not Friedman.
Following Stigler from Columbia, if I get that right.
Exactly. So Tom had done his he graduated with an undergraduate degree from Harvard, then moved over to Columbia for a master's in economics. And Stigler was at Columbia at the time. And he planned to pursue his PhD under Stigler at Columbia.
Writing on Say's law, as I recall.
Yes, I believe. Yes, I believe that's right.
Supply creates its own demand, and kind of
exactly.
anti-Keynesian spirit.
Yeah. And that's Sowell's comfort zone. That's his specialty. Say's law, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill.
As I recall, Stigler was kind of skeptical of Tom's approach, was he not? He needed to be convinced.
Yes, he gets into that because, as you know, as an economist, Say's law is well-trod territory. I mean, it's not, it's I guess it's your English major wanting to do a dissertation on Shakespeare or something.
Right.
What hasn't already been said
about... What hasn't been said, I know.
About Macbeth. So yes, Tom goes to Stigler and says, I want to do something on Say's law. I think I have something unique to say. And Stigler is quite skeptical of this. Not only is he skeptical that Tom has something unique to say, When Tom tells him what that is, he doesn't agree with Tom's conclusions. So it's a double whammy there for Tom. But I will say this about both Stigler and Friedman. They saw something in Tom at Chicago. And it's worth noting that Tom was still very much a man of the left when he was pursuing his PhD, as well as when he was in college.
He wrote his undergraduate thesis on Marx, did he not?
On Marx, exactly. Marxian economics. His first publication in an academic paper was on Marx. He was a Marxian, and he was still a Marxian while studying under Friedman and Stigler. And what's fascinating is that there's a story I tell in the biography where he's running out of money. He's thinking about leaving academia and just going to get a job in the private sector and abandoning his pursuit of a PhD. And unbeknownst to him, Stigler and Friedman go to a foundation, the Earhart Foundation, which no longer exists, but it did back then, and secure a grant for him to continue his studies. And they had to submit a letter of recommendation in order to secure this grant. And Stigler and Friedman write in the letter, he's a socialist now, but he's too smart to stay that way. You need to support this guy. And it tells you the type of confidence they had in him, even though at the time he was not someone who agreed with their approach to economics. And so Sowell has always been his own man. He's always been someone who thought for himself, had to see things through on his own, for better or worse. And it's unfortunate that over the years he's gotten this reputation by some on the left as simply an acolyte of people like Stigler or Friedman, when in fact he's someone who had to reach his conclusions on his own and did, and they'll tell you that. So Tom is earning a PhD in economic history, in the history of ideas. And he's studying Adam Smith, he's studying Sismoni, he's studying David Ricardo and those guys. And that's what he intended to focus on as an academic, teaching economics, particularly to undergraduates at a small school where you can get to know your students and so forth. Tom wanted to be a teacher, first and foremost. So when we get to a conflict of visions in the mid-'80s, it's sort of a return to his specialty when he starts to write about these folks that he had studied very early on in his academic career, and starts to get into writing about social theory and the history of ideas.
Who funds the news outlets that you rely on? What agendas shape their coverage? How accurate have they been in their reporting in the past? If you want to know the answers to these questions, I suggest you check out Ground News. It's the website and app I rely on daily to stay informed, cut through the noise, and get closer to the truth. Visit ground.news/Glenn Show to see for yourself how it works. My favorite feature of Ground News is the blind spot feed. It shows you stories that are disproportionately reported by either the left or the right. About 20 such stories every day. Here are a couple crime-related stories, one overlooked by the left and the other by the right. This one is not covered by the left. Representative Fine proposes bill to allow lawsuits against judges releasing violent offenders. And this one is not covered by the right. State pays mother $4.6 million settlement for inmate's death in Las Vegas area prison, lawyer says. For both of these and for every story, Ground News gives you a breakdown of the sources covering it, the bias of the media outlets reporting across the left, center, and right, how reliable these sources have been in the past, and who owns them. This is the kind of news analysis you won't find anywhere else. Right now, my viewers can get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan, which is the same plan I use. Make sure you subscribe using my link at ground.news/Glenn Show. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code when signing up. That's ground.news/Glenn Show.
Okay, so let's talk about these books for a little while. Maybe we should start with Knowledge and Decisions. So, Knowledge and Decisions is an extrapolation of an essay that Friedrich von Hayek published in the American Economic Review in like 1945, if I'm not mistaken, or 44.
I think it's 45. Use of Knowledge in Society was the title.
Indeed.
Yeah.
But it goes way beyond Hayek. In fact, Hayek had a review of Knowledge and Decisions in which he said, I hadn't planned on reading this book this summer, but I picked it up and I couldn't put it down. Damn, it's the best book written in the social sciences in the last year or two, as far as I can tell.
Yeah. Amazing. Amazing. So Tom, a few years ago, Tom was awarded something called the Hayek Prize. And he was unable to attend the ceremony. It was around the time of COVID. He wasn't traveling. And I was asked to receive it on his behalf and offer a few remarks. And I remember saying in my remarks that if Hayek were alive, he would not only approve of Tom receiving this award in his name, he would probably say to the judges, what took you so long to award it to Tom Sowell? Because Tom Sowell had not only been a student of Hayek's thinking about economics and social theory, he had been an actual student of Friedrich Hayek at the University of Chicago in the early 1960s, where Hayek was still teaching when Tom was there pursuing his PhD. And Tom took a course with Hayek in the history of ideas and wrote a paper on the aforementioned Jean-Baptiste Say's law, which was later published in an academic paper and which received a very high mark from Hayek. And so Hayek was a fan of Sowell when Sowell was a student of Hayek. And so later he goes on and writes this book on knowledge and society and knowledge and decisions. And says in the preface that it was the spark for the book was this essay you mentioned. It was an essay that he had been assigned in Milton Friedman's price theory course, which every PhD student at the University of Chicago was required to take. And he had no idea at the time why Friedman had assigned this essay. He read it, but it didn't mean anything to him. And it wasn't until he had his first job teaching at Rutgers University, a teacher's college at Rutgers University. It was called Douglas College at the time. And he was assigned to teach a course on the Soviet economy, he says. And while he's preparing to teach this course, he goes back and reads this essay again that he had been assigned by Friedman. And then things start to fall in place. What was going on? What was wrong with the Soviet economy? And he says there was a knowledge deficit. The people with the power didn't have the knowledge, and the people with the knowledge didn't have the power. And so Hayek is drawing on the ideas in that essay and in his work writ large. He's drawing on his mentor, which was von Mises, another Austrian economist.
Ludwig von Mises.
His mentor. Ludwig von Mises, that's right. And so Hayek is one of the, let's put it this way, in the same way that Adam Smith was talked about the importance of a division of labor in a market economy, Hayek talked about the division of knowledge in a market economy. And that was his continuation of Adam Smith's economic writings. And that's how he sort of carried the torch. And that's the sort of mentality he brought to his approach to economic theory. And so Tom was very much taken in by that approach, the market economy, this sort of self-equilibrating system.
Spontaneous order.
Spontaneous order. And Tom was very, very, very much influenced by Hayek. You can see Hayek is a through line in a lot of Tom's writings. Again, whether he's writing on economics per se or whether he's writing on other issues, you can see Hayek in Tom. And so when I went to accept this award on behalf of Tom, I tried to get that across in my remarks. Tom was a big fan of Hayek and had studied under Hayek.
Well, the thing about Hayek is, as I recall that essay and learning about these ideas when I was a student, it's the price system that solves this problem of diffuse information and of the people who have to make decisions, being able to make those decisions based on the relevant knowledge of the relevant facts and circumstances. The price system, almost miraculously, when you think about it, because it's a relatively economical way of communicating a lot of information, lets the producer of something know whether or not the different inputs that he's using and trading off to produce are being combined in the right way relative to the availability and the cost of those inputs being supplied to him, which depends on information and that is in the hands of very different people in very different places. But if they coordinate on their decisions on the price system, they coordinate their decisions on one another's information. This is the kind of idea.
It's a communication system. Prices are a way for people to communicate, even when they don't realize they're communicating, and reach the right decisions. And that's how, in other words, you can put together a lot of smart people and put them in charge of running an economy, but no one is smarter than than the collective intelligence of all the individuals in a society. And the people who best know their own needs are those individuals. And to the extent that the decision makers are further and further removed from the people who must pay a price for the decisions that are actually made, you're moving in the wrong direction. And that was the problem with the Soviet economy. And that was the problem Hayek was getting at with central planning generally. You want the decision makers to be, to the best extent that you can, the people who pay the price for making the right or wrong decision. And bureaucrats that are far removed from those people who bear the consequences are less likely to make the right decision, no matter how intelligent they are, because what they need to know is simply unknowable at that level, at that remove.
Yeah.
But the other thing that Hayek, when Hayek wrote that review of knowledge and decisions, he uses this anecdote. So this is 1980. He's writing it in Reason magazine. And he tells the story about how he received a copy of the book in the mail and he was too busy with his own research to read it right away. So he put it aside. And he says, my goodness, when I got around to reading the book, I realized that if I had read it right away, I would have made faster progress with the research I was working on. Now, keep in mind, Hayek is already Hayek in 1980. So this is high praise coming from someone like that. And it was also, it wasn't just Hayek. James Buchanan, who again is a big deal Nobel
These
Prize
are both
winning
Nobel
economist.
Prize recipients, yeah.
Public choice theory, University of Virginia school, big deal. Sent Tom a private letter after Knowledge and Decisions came out that said, not only should every social scientist read this book, which is marvelous, he says, Tom, I wish I had written this book. And I don't recall ever saying that to anyone else. Think about that kind of praise coming from James Buchanan. So it wasn't just Hayek. And what it told me as Tom's biographer, Glenn, is that if Tom had never written a single word about affirmative action,
we come back to that point, and it's a valid point. It's a very
he would have
important
distinguished himself as a leading 20th century scholar.
He was a star. He was a star within his own
and recognized as such at the time. Yeah.
No, I can very much appreciate that.
I mean, Hayek said in that essay, in that review, I think he says something to the effect of that, and this is in praise of Tom. He says, this guy's sort of intellectual agility. Hayek says, an economist who is only an economist can't even be a good economist. And Tom is more than just, he's speaking to Tom's ability to write about sociology, to write about political philosophy, to write about history. And he brings all that to bear in his writings about economics. And that is what is distinguishing him as such a tremendous economist.
I'm thinking of one example of this combination, this broadness of vision across the disciplines within the social sciences. And that is Tom's extension of the Hayekian argument about knowledge and institutions to seeing in things like the family and a transgenerational embodiment of knowledge.
Yes.
Norms and customs and practices that are taken to be old-fashioned and, why should I do that? Well, the wisdom of the ancestors, so to speak, is embodied in these norms and practices and institutions. Yeah. And you discard them at your peril.
Yeah. These decision-making units, he calls them, decision-making units. The family, religion can play this role.
Religion, corporations.
Tradition can play this role. And you cannot abandon these things willy-nilly. And they are the best way to socialize the next generation. And yes, Tom has gotten into that. And that is
think about the wisdom of that. I mean, it tells you don't defer to elitists specialized in certain narrow constructions of knowledge, and don't be peremptory. Don't be so arrogant to think that you can just reinvent and remake. Deference in a Burkean spirit, deference to our inherited cultural legacy.
And this gets us to conflict of visions, if you want to talk about that book. And that is where Tom really lays out that template I was referring to earlier. And the visions that are in contrast that he's talking about there is what he describes as the unconstrained vision and the constrained vision. And sometimes he calls the constrained vision the tragic vision. And these are really just terms for describing human nature. The people with the unconstrained vision see that there are no limits to sort of human betterment. We can not only deal with or manage problems like inequality or poverty or racism, but solve them entirely. We have that within our capabilities as human beings. If we just apply the proper amount of reason, weak and willpower, we can eliminate these problems in life. And he contrasts that unconstrained or more utopian vision with this constrained vision of human nature that says, no, these things will always be with us. And what we need to focus on are putting in place processes that sort of help us deal with and manage problems that we're probably never going to fully solve. So I may want to get rid of war. I might want world peace. I might want a crime-free world. I might want to eliminate racism and inequality, but that's probably never going to happen. So in the interim, we need a military for deterrence. We need a judicial system to sort of adjudicate disputes in a civil manner. We need law and order. We need jails and prisons to put away people who are not going to abide by societal norms, because those people will always be with us, no matter how much we wish they will go away entirely. It's not realistic. So these are the contrasting visions.
And the only question is how much. It's
right. And so one thing that distinguishes the two visions is that one side believes in what economists call trade-offs,
right,
and the other side, not so much. So the constrained vision says we can try and do this, and it may help some people here, or it might help us in this respect, but there will be other consequences to doing that might not be as advantageous. So we need to find the best trade-off. The unconstrained vision, the more utopian vision, says we can do this, and everything will be fine for everybody involved going forward forever. And Tom says these are the ways that different people view the world. And so these types of visions are what people bring to our disputes and have brought to our disputes over equality and justice and fairness going back hundreds of years, and not just here in the US, but in Europe, in Western Europe. And so a conflict of visions traces the origins of these two disputes and how to think about human nature. And some of the principles in the books representing the constrained vision are people like Adam Smith, and people like William Godwin, who you mentioned earlier. I'm sorry, not William Godwin. You mentioned Burke, Edmund Burke. So people like Adam Smith and Edmund Burke would represent
Godwin's on the other side,
constrained vision. William Godwin, who's this British political philosopher, he's not as well known today, but your viewers and listeners might know him better as the father of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. Yes. But he was also an 18th century political philosopher and journalist who was very influential and someone who was pushing this unconstrained vision hundreds of years ago. Another person mentioned in the unconstrained vision that Tom deals with in a conflict of visions is Nicolas Cortese, the French philosopher and mathematician, who also shared this sort of unconstrained vision. On that side, you also have people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. John Rawls would be a more modern example of that. Dworkin would be another modern example of that. But all of these people can be traced to what we today would call the sort of social justice advocates that are still with us, and share that sort of utopian mindset about how we can not only deal or manage problems we have today, but fix them entirely if we just have the right people and the right policies in place. And again, you also obviously have the intellectual descendants of Adam Smith and Edmund Burke on the other side, who are still out there saying, no, that's probably not going to happen. We just need to put in place systems and processes that help us deal with these problems as fairly as possible. And Tom, and by the way, Conflict of Visions was a sort of informal trilogy of books that Tom put out. The first one was A Conflict of Visions, published, I believe, in 1987. He followed it up with a book called The Vision of the Anointed in the mid-1990s. And then the final book in the trilogy came in the late 90s, and it was called The Quest for Cosmic Justice. And the latter two books are a little more polemical than A Conflict of Visions, because in A Conflict of Visions, he's just laying out the template. Here are these two ways of thinking about justice and equality and power.
It's clear where he stands.
Right. But in the latter two books, he sort of takes on the arguments in more detail, and they're a little more polemical as a result. Each book stands on its own, but they are a sort of informal trilogy on social theory and political philosophy, and ultimately on social justice, to use today's terminology.
Okay. And you were at pains to emphasize that this, I called it theoretical, and I noticed you wince a little bit when I said theoretical, because he's not highfalutin. He's very much on the ground. He's not abstract for abstraction's sake. But there are principled frameworks of thought around which you would organize a critique of any particular program or whatever. They are, well, maybe they are like price theory. They are insights into social organization and political possibility.
Well, that gets back to Chicago. That's the Chicago school. That's Friedman. That's Stigler. That's Hayek. What is economics about here? Is it just an extension of mathematics? Is it elegant theories?
We had this argument the first time we talked about Tom, and I was trying to chastise you, Jason, saying, no, the science is important. But now that I've spent the last 3 months reading Tom Sowell, I'm chastened. I must say, I'm a little bit. I even went to ChatGPT and looked up, Paul Samuelson and Milton Friedman and compared their methodological approaches, and I learned a lot because Paul, who was the teacher of my teachers, was like, man, we're doing some math up in here. This is what we are about. We are dotting our I's and crossing our T's. And the Chicago tradition was much more panoramic, and empirical.
Pragmatic. They would say pragmatic.
Too. Yeah, but I mean,
real world problems. We're trying to look at, You look at not just Friedman and Stigler, but Robert Lucas and that whole Gary Becker,
whose
those
Nobel
guys.
Prize winning paper is very mathematical, by the way, because it's not like they couldn't do it. It's not like they could not do it.
Oh, no, right. But they saw economics as a way of addressing real world problems using empiricism and results oriented. It wasn't just about elegant theories. And I'll tell you something else that Tom got from Friedman and Stigler and the Chicago School, which was this interest in explaining his discipline to non-experts and non-economists. After Friedman wins his Nobel Prize, in I think 76 maybe, he then joins Hoover, but he also starts writing a column, a magazine column. He's lecturing on college campuses. He's hosting a TV show on PBS.
Free to choose with his wife, Rose Friedman.
There you go. And so Tom, I think, got something about being a public intellectual out of watching Friedman do this. And so, to them, economics was just not about, it wasn't just about impressing your peers in the faculty lounge. It was about explaining your discipline to non-economists. That economic literacy in the general public was a public good and something that should be promoted and something that it was incumbent upon the experts to take it upon themselves to do. And Tom took that very seriously. And as you know, that's not always looked highly upon among leading economists, sort of reducing yourself or stooping to writing for the general public. It's not something that's always rewarded professionally. But Tom saw it as something he wanted to do. And so most of his books are written for the general public. I would say books like Knowledge and Decisions and Conflict of Visions, they're going to take a little more time to get through. They're a little tougher to read than some of his other books, but still, they can be absorbed, I think, by someone someone with a general education.
They're not filled with jargon, and they don't rely upon some elaborate
and
inner sanctum
equations
kind of knowledge.
Right. But most of his books are even less demanding than Knowledge of Decisions and Quest for Cosmic Justice and Conflict of Visions. And Tom took a lot of pride in that, and I think that is something that he got from Milton Friedman. Frankly, yes.
Do you think that in his writings, I was just going to say earlier that you were at some pains to point out that his main area of contribution hasn't got anything to do with race and inequality, that it's the other way around. He is first and foremost a historian of economic thought and a political philosopher. And he comes to these questions about affirmative action or race and culture having a grounding and a professional reputation in this more general area. But how did his thought, as elaborated in Knowledge and Decisions and A Conflict of Visions, influence his writings on race and culture, do you think? What do you think?
His personal?
His that you can address, but I'm interested in how his intellectual, how the sensibility of the constrained and the unconstrained vision in contrast with one another, or the insight that Hayek has put his finger on something important when he talks about how the market coordinates diffuse information. And I'm going to take that point and run with it in my Knowledge and Decisions. How does that, or does it, show itself in his writings about race and disparities and so on?
No. I think there is a connection. There's definitely a connection. The connection is that I think Tom's personal experience, his background, in many respects, has informed his intellectual output. And he starts out, as we mentioned earlier briefly, as a Marxist. Now remember, Tom is someone born in 1930 in the Deep South during the Depression, dirt poor family. and he's someone who has a tough upbringing. He's an orphan. His father dies before he was born. His mother dies giving birth to a younger sibling when Tom is an infant. So he never knew either parent. He's taken in by a great aunt who raises him as her own child. She already has two adult children, and never tells Tom that she's not his mother. He finds this out later in life when he's a teenager, around 16 or 17. It causes a huge rift in the family. Tom quits high school, leaves home, and he's on his own from 17 years old on. And never fully repairs that rift with the great aunt or other members, some other members of his family. This is the origins of Thomas Sowell. He's on his own from a very young age. He takes a job as a messenger, as a laborer, anything an unskilled black young person can do back then. Now we're into the 1940s, and tells about a story about taking a job at Western Union, where the offices were located in Lower Manhattan at the time. He lived up in Harlem, and he takes the bus home some days. Some days he takes the subway, but other days he'll take a double-decker bus, and it starts in Lower Manhattan and goes up Fifth Avenue past all the fancy shopping districts, turns over onto Riverside Drive into the more affluent residential neighborhoods, continues north. Eventually, it crosses a viaduct around 120th Street or so, and then it enters the tenements of Harlem, 135th Street. He gets off, looks around, and he says, "What just happened? Why did that look like that down there where I got on this bus, and this looks like this up here? What is going on?" And he says, Marx explained that in very accessible terms. He says, I started reading Marx. He picked up a collection of essays by a journalist back then, guy named Max Lerner, who was a lawyer and an activist and a pretty popular writer at the time and a columnist, journalist. And Max Lerner had published a collection of essays, and Tom found it on some used book stand, and he read it, and that was his introduction to Marx. And Lerner, by the way, later turned a little more. Lerner lived into, I believe, the 1980s, and had some nice things to say about Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher by the time he died. So he moved a little bit to the right. But back when Tom was reading him in his heyday, he was very much a man of the left. And that is where Tom got a lot of his introduction to Marxism from. And Tom said that Marx explained a lot of what he saw, a lot of what he was living at the time, in very easy terms. The greedy capitalists, the bourgeoisie, the exploitation of the workers. Yeah, that's me. That's what's going on. That's what I'm looking at here. And so he took that in. And it wasn't, he says, studying under Friedman or Stigler at Chicago that changed his mind about Marx and socialism. It was real world experience. He talks about taking a job with the labor department in college, where he's looking at a minimum wage program in Puerto Rico that the U.S. government runs. And he's noticing that as we increase the minimum wage, employment decreases. And he's wondering what is going on here. And moreover, why no one at the Labor Department seems to care that this is the result of the policy. And he says that was an initial insight into not only the nature of bureaucracies, but how well-meaning policies may not be as beneficial to the intended beneficiaries. So it was sort of a real-world experience that started to change Tom's mind. And that would be a pattern throughout his life that he would bring into academia with him. And so he's not someone who liked to harp on his personal background as a sort of way of winning sympathy for his views, but it was a background that he would draw on to inform his own scholarship going forward. And he's very upfront about that. And you know, he talks about how I ended up in a profession with a lot of people that did not have the experience that I had. They talked about things in theory. They theorized about things that I had experienced in real life. And I'm sure you could say the same thing about your experience, Glenn, in terms of where you ended up in life and where you started and the people you were surrounded with, and how your own background can inform your scholarship, you know, through no fault or credit of your own, just based on happenstance and where you came from and what you experienced.
I see a number of Sowellian themes in that Puerto Rican minimum wage policy example. Like, you judge a policy by its results, not by the intentions of the policymakers. Uh, and it really matters who decides, not just what the decision is, but sometimes the most important question is how the decision is going to be arrived at. Uh, and obviously, that was a top-down move, and the bureaucratic snafus are a part of that.
You know, Tom does not like to talk about um, his background as sort of a way of winning sympathy for his point of view. And this is, I think it's an important point to make, because he's someone who has said quite bluntly, you know, my ideas, says this in his memoir, my ideas um, and should be judged on their merits, not based on the background of the person making them, or the socioeconomic circumstances of the person making them. They should be judged on whether they stand up to scrutiny or they don't, regardless of who is making them. And he's very adamant about that. And to the extent that he has talked about his personal background, it's almost defensively. He does it when he's accused of reaching his conclusions because the person assumes they're based on someone with a background of privilege or someone who doesn't understand what Black people had to go through or how tough we had it back in the day and so forth. Then Tom will push back quite hard and say, I need no lectures from you on segregation and oppression and being denied housing with me and my wife while we're looking for an apartment, or being denied jobs, or serving my country in the military and not being able to eat at certain restaurants on the way back home from the bear. You know, then Tom will go off on you about that. But it's done defensively. It's not something that he prefaces an argument he's going to make about this or that on.
Let me ask you an unfair question. How do you think Tom's career would have been different if he had not been Black?
He'd be a Nobel Prize winning, he'd be Friedman or Stigler or Hayek. Oh, I have no doubt about that, Glenn. I mean, I went back and actually
Man, what a
reread.
compliment that is.
I really do believe
Because,
that.
excuse me for interrupting, and I want you to finish your thought, but I wondered then, therefore, what you think his Blackness, how it impeded him from achieving that.
You know, I asked when I was researching the biography. I asked a number of people about that, and my conclusions, my answer to your question was their answer when I asked them the same question. That if anything, Tom's uh, uh, decision to weigh in on racial controversies has only hurt his academic prestige. It's only hurt him within the circles of people who determine who the Friedmans and Hayeks, who's going to be rewarded for their academic output. So Tom, as I've said before, was canceled before we used to use that term. Tom, and he doesn't mind. He wasn't doing it for the prestige, but I think his willingness to weigh in on these racial controversies in such a politically incorrect manner has only hurt his academic career in terms of recognition, in terms of the honors he's received, because the people who make those determinations were unable to look past that or unwilling to look past that, and so that's why I say that. But for that, I have no doubt that he would have. It's a really hard it's a really hard thought experiment because on the other hand, I say that, but on the other hand, I think if Tom had his druthers, Glenn, Tom would be um, someone who stayed in academia, teach as an economics professor. He would have, and his again, when he went into academia, it was to teach. It was not to research or write books. He wanted to teach, particularly at a small college where you could get to know the students. What happened, the problem was that this was the 1960s. And college campuses had become platforms for anti-war movements and gay rights movements and civil rights movements and all this. And Tom wanted to teach the way he had been taught. And that was just tougher and tougher and tougher to do
Jason,
in the 1960s.
I read his A Personal Odyssey, his memoir.
Yeah.
And when he talks about his travails at the various colleges that he did teach at Cornell, at this women's college in New Jersey, I can't remember the name of it.
Douglas.
And the, knock him down, drag him out fights that he got into with people about maintaining his standards and conducting his affairs in a way that had integrity. And he's not a guy that, leans back and lets people push him around. I mean, he's got principles and he stands by them, and he's willing to fall on his sword if necessary. I mean,
but Glenn, that also worked against him in a certain way, because I read that biography too, and what my takeaway was that even in Tom's telling of these incidences, sometimes you're sympathizing with the other side.
Yeah, I know, man. I know.
You're saying yourself, Tom, really? You quit over that? You wouldn't bend a little bit over that? And it tells me, if you want to, and you know this.
They wanted him to grade on a curve, and he didn't want to grade on a curve,
So, if you want a life in academia, I think you do need to be more compromising than Tom was willing to be. If you want a social life on campus, in the faculty lounge, if you don't want to be a pariah on campus, you sort of need to be more compromising than I think Tom was willing to be. So maybe he was never cut out for the long haul in academia. I don't know. It's a interesting thought experiment. But I do think that if Tom had was judged solely on books like Conflict of Visions, books like Knowledge and Decisions, his writings on Say's Law and classical economics in general, if he had continued pursuing those things, just social theory, I think he certainly would have been a contender for the highest honors of the economics profession. I have no doubt that was the trajectory. If he had decided to stay that course, that is what was headed his way.
Now, I can recall coming along in the 70s as a student and then a young professor, and Tom was in the early part of his ascendancy to the highest status and visibility that he attained. And then the National Economics Association, this is the African American, grew out of the caucus of Black economists. These are the Black economists. They were death on Tom Sowell. Tom Sowell was Uncle Tom Sowell. He was a sellout. He was a traitor, and I'm just wondering did he care what they thought about him?
No, he didn't. He's always had a thick skin. I want to qualify it because he's a human being. We all care, Glenn, right? I mean, no one likes to be called names. No one likes to be called a sellout. So I'm sure on a certain level he cared, but he did not let that concern keep him from following the data, following the evidence. However politically incorrect the conclusions were, he felt it necessary to report them. One of the stories I tell in the biography is the one about Tom's research on race and intelligence. Tom did a very, very deep dive into theories about Black inferiority in intellectual inferiority, and whether it's genetically based, the nature versus nurture dispute, and um, and there were a lot of Black academics out there who didn't want to do the research because they were afraid of what they might find. Tom wasn't afraid, and his attitude was, if we want to help a lagging group, in this case Blacks, we need to know where they are, because we can only help them get where we want them to be from where they are. And so ignoring where they are or pretending they're not where they are is not doing them any favors in terms of getting them where we want them to be. And so Tom went there, so to speak. He did the research, and he took on not only the critics at the time who were theorizing about Black inferiority, genetic inferiority, intelligence, and so forth. He continued to do so throughout his career. And he continued to do so even when it meant, Glenn, taking on A-list conservatives who he felt were flirting with some of these theories. And
Like
I'm talking specifically about Charles Murray. Arthur Jensen was
Richard
the person.
Herrnstein.
Arthur Jensen was the person he took on initially. And this is back in the 1970s when Jensen was the foremost proponent of these theories. But in the 1990s, it would be Charles Murray. And Charles Murray, as you know, A-list conservative who had made a name for himself in writing about welfare reform and poverty programs and criticisms of the Great Society, all things Tom agreed with by and large, things I agree with by and large. But then Murray put out a book flirting with Jensen, embracing really a lot of what Jensen was saying.
The Bell Curve, published with Richard Herrnstein as the co-author.
If you want to know what Tom Sowell is made of, you should read Tom Sowell's book review of The Bell Curve, which runs some 3,500 words and was published in the American Spectator shortly after The Bell Curve was published. He shreds that book to pieces, Glenn. He is merciless. He credits Murray where he thinks Murray deserves credit. He says, here's where I agree with Murray, and there is much to agree with. But where he disagrees with Murray, he pulls no punches whatsoever.
This is primarily I just want to be explicit, Jason. This is about the genetic basis of the observed differences in academic and cognitive performance between the racial groups. And Tom is rejecting that thesis.
And whether those differences are driven primarily through hereditary genetic factors
or
through environmental factors.
Or environmental factors.
Right. That's
and Tom is arguing on behalf of the environmental side of that.
Well, Tom is saying it's not 100% either.
Yeah.
But he's saying to the extent we need to weigh one side more than the other, the evidence overwhelmingly is that it's environmental. not genetic. And part of the reason he gets there is he looks at the variance. Basically, it gets to, if you go back a couple generations to, say, the early 1900s, and you look at certain racial and ethnic groups, non-blacks, Poles, for example, Italians, and you look at their rise in IQ levels over a couple generations, 20, 25 points over 60, 70 years. That's larger than the black-white gap, which suggests to Tom that something other than genetics is going on, because genetics don't work that fast. You don't get genetic differences showing up after 70 years. It's something that takes much, much longer. And so Tom's argument is that alone shows that something other than genetics, while genetics may be playing a role, the idea that it is playing the main role is something he finds lacking in that theory, just based on looking at the rise in IQ levels of other racial and ethnic groups. And so this isn't, I mean, we're getting off on a tangent here, but my point is that this all speaks to Tom's intellectual independence,
integrity,
his intellectual courage, that he is willing to take on anyone, even people who are more or less ideological allies on most issues, when he thinks that they are wrong. He does not pull his punches. And it's funny that Black intellectuals would not have more of an appreciation for that characteristic of Tom. I mean, if you're a person who wants to argue against Arthur Jensen or Charles Murray's bell curve, Tom should be your ally. And yet he has received no credit, or virtually no credit, from the Black left, from his willingness to take on those types of arguments, which I think is very telling when it comes to what is driving the Black left.
Well, I think we're at the end of the hour, Jason, and that serves very well as a closing comment on the great Tom Sowell. I look forward to seeing you out in Palo Alto in October. Thanks so much, Jason Riley of the Wall Street Journal and the Manhattan Institute, and author of Maverick, which is a biography of the economist and political philosopher Thomas Sowell.
Thank you, Glenn. Appreciate it.